The President of the United States just sent a message to the Norwegian Prime Minister suggesting part of his Greenland crusade is rooted in his failure to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Not because of strategic concerns, not because of economic interests, because he was denied an award. Within the same day, he posted on social media targeting lawmakers with the phrase seditious behaviour, punishable by death. 2 incidents. One day, and now members of Congress are openly questioning whether Donald Trump is fit for office. I'm Elizabeth Carter, and this is investigative journalism that follows evidence wherever it leads. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. Leave a comment below telling me if you think any president should threaten elected officials with death. Share this video with everyone you know. This is the only official channel. What I'm about to show you is happening in real time in Washington, and the implications are spreading across every corner of our democracy. Here's what we're dealing with tonight in plain language. A sitting president exhibited 2 separate concerning behaviours within hours of each other that have triggered unprecedented calls for his removal under the 25th Amendment. This isn't about politics. It's about documented incidents that are forcing even his allies to ask fundamental questions about presidential fitness. Tonight, I'm going to walk you through the timeline, the congressional response, and the constitutional crisis we're witnessing, so you can see exactly how we arrived at this breaking point. Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts looked at these incidents and posted publicly, "Invoke the 25th Amendment." Democratic Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii described the president's communications as the ramblings of a man who has lost touch with reality. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut said he is not stable at all, and his reality is warped. These are not routine political criticisms. These are sitting senators publicly questioning the mental fitness of a president. Let that sink in. 3 United States senators used official platforms to declare the president unfit for office within hours of 2 specific incidents. Translation: we have crossed into unprecedented constitutional territory, where members of Congress are openly discussing removal of a sitting president for incapacity. Think about what had to happen for senators to go that far. The Norwegian letter incident alone might have been dismissed as eccentric diplomacy. The threatening social media posts alone might have been framed as political hyperbole. But together, within one day, they created something different. A pattern that forced constitutional questions. And here's what nobody is saying out loud yet. This isn't just about 2 incidents. It's about what these incidents reveal about decision-making processes at the highest level of government. When the President of the United States links foreign policy decisions to personal grievances about awards, that tells us something about how those decisions are being made. When he threatens lawmakers investigating him with death, that tells us something about how he views constitutional checks and balances. The domino effect is already in motion. First domino, documented erratic behaviour. Second domino, congressional alarm across party lines. Third domino, constitutional crisis discussions. And we're about to see where the next domino falls, because this story is just beginning. The incidents of one day have opened questions that demand answers about the next 3 years of American leadership. And those answers are coming, whether we're ready for them or not. But these 2 incidents didn't happen in a vacuum. What we witnessed in one day is actually the culmination of a pattern that's been building since December 2024. A pattern that congressional staffers have been quietly documenting. A pattern that medical professionals are now speaking about publicly. And it's a pattern that explains why 3 senators felt compelled to invoke the nuclear option of the 25th Amendment. Let me show you the timeline that led to this constitutional crisis. December 2024. Photographs begin surfacing showing visible bruising on the president's hands during public appearances. Congressional staffers privately note changes in his gait and apparent leg swelling. These observations weren't partisan talking points. They were documented concerns from people who see the president regularly. January 2026. Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. goes on record describing the president's diet as unhinged and highly unhealthy. But here's the quote that should alarm everyone. Kennedy said, and I'm reading this directly, "I don't know how he's alive, but he is." Translation: the person responsible for the president's health just admitted publicly he cannot explain how the president is surviving his lifestyle. Think about that for a moment. The health secretary cannot explain how the president is still functioning. But it gets worse. The Daily Beast reported on January 1st that Trump appeared sick and sleepy, documenting his recent history of dozing during public appearances. Congressional staffers reported he was now requesting fewer, more important meetings. Translation: his schedule was being reduced because of capacity concerns. And then came the Wall Street Journal interview, where the president himself conceded he was taking a larger dosage of aspirin and ignoring medical advice. Let that sink in. The president publicly admitted he's not following his doctor's orders while taking increased medication. Here's what congressional staffers have been documenting since March 2025. Recurring visible swelling, changes in walking patterns, reduced meeting attendance, increased reliance on staff for routine decisions. When lawmakers started demanding medical transparency, they weren't fishing for political ammunition. They were responding to observable changes in presidential functioning. Dr. Jonathan Reiner, a CNN medical analyst and former heart doctor for Dick Cheney, looked at this accumulating evidence and made an extraordinary public statement. He urged Congress to open a bipartisan probe into the president's fitness for office. Translation: a medical professional with experience treating high-level officials believes there's enough evidence to question presidential capacity. And here's the domino chain that explains how we got to constitutional crisis territory. First domino: observable health decline since December. Second domino: medical professional concerns becoming public. Third domino: congressional staff documentation of functional changes. Fourth domino: reduced presidential schedule and capacity. Fifth domino: erratic behavior, incidents increasing in frequency and severity. The Norwegian letter and death threat posts weren't isolated incidents. They were the culmination of months of escalating concerns that people inside the system have been tracking. When senators called for the 25th Amendment, they weren't reacting to one bad day. They were reacting to a documented pattern of decline that finally crossed into behavior that threatens democratic institutions. But here's what nobody in official Washington wants to admit out loud. The people closest to presidential power have been watching this pattern develop for months. They've been documenting it, they've been concerned about it, and they've been hoping it wouldn't reach the point where constitutional remedies became necessary. It just did. And that's why what happened in one day forced the conversation nobody wanted to have, because the pattern could no longer be ignored when it manifested as threats against the legislative branch. The question isn't whether there are concerns about presidential fitness. The question is what Congress is going to do about documented evidence that those concerns are escalating into constitutional crisis territory. But health concerns became a secondary issue the moment the president started threatening lawmakers with death. Because when declining capacity intersects with threatening behavior toward the legislative branch, we're no longer talking about medical fitness. We're talking about constitutional crisis. Here's what happened when the president posted seditious behavior, punishable by death, on social media. Within hours, 22 government officials received direct death threats from the president's supporters. Not political criticism, not heated rhetoric. Death threats against sitting members of Congress investigating presidential conduct. Let me be crystal clear about what this means. The President of the United States used his platform to suggest that lawmakers exercising constitutional oversight should face execution, and his supporters immediately translated that into specific threats against named officials. 3 members of Congress were so alarmed they filed formal complaints with the U.S. Capitol Police. The Capitol Police, citing safety concerns, declined to comment on those complaints. Translation: the threats were serious enough that law enforcement is treating them as credible security risks. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez received messages saying she should be executed for questioning presidential fitness. Representative Adam Schiff's office was flooded with calls demanding his death for seditious behavior. Senator Chuck Schumer's staff documented dozens of threats referencing the president's post within 6 hours. These aren't abstract political consequences. These are real people with real families receiving real death threats because the president suggested they deserved execution. Think about that. Members of Congress are now afraid for their lives because they're doing their constitutional job of oversight. But here's where it gets unprecedented. No president in American history has ever directly suggested that lawmakers investigating him should face death. Not Nixon during Watergate, not Clinton during impeachment, not even Andrew Johnson during his constitutional crisis. We are in uncharted territory where presidential rhetoric is creating genuine fear among the legislative branch. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe looked at these posts and said this represents a fundamental breach of separation of powers. When the executive branch suggests the legislative branch deserves death for oversight activities, you're not looking at political hardball. You're looking at authoritarian intimidation tactics. And here's the domino effect this created. First domino, presidential death threat posts. Second domino, immediate supporter violence threats against 22 officials. Third domino, formal law enforcement complaints filed by Congress members. Fourth domino, security protocol changes affecting how lawmakers can do their jobs. Fifth domino, constitutional scholars warning about separation of powers violations. Security details for targeted lawmakers were immediately increased. Congressional district offices implemented new safety protocols. Some lawmakers changed their public schedules out of safety concerns. Translation: the president's posts directly disrupted the ability of Congress to function normally. The White House response was to claim this was robust political debate. Let me translate that for you. Threatening lawmakers with death for doing oversight is not robust debate. It's intimidation designed to stop constitutional processes. Lars Christian Brask, Deputy Speaker of the Danish Parliament, watched these developments and told Sky News, "If I could come with some advice, it would be for the Senate and the House to start to take control of the political power in America. Because with this mad and erratic behaviour, you have to ask the question, is the president capable of running the United States?" International allies are now publicly questioning American presidential fitness. That is not normal diplomatic language. That is allies expressing genuine alarm about the stability of American leadership. And here's what should terrify everyone about this escalation. The president didn't just threaten lawmakers once. He's done it repeatedly. He's normalized it. He's made suggesting congressional death a routine part of his political communication. Which means we're not dealing with one bad moment. We're dealing with systematic intimidation of the legislative branch. When senators called for the 25th Amendment, they weren't overreacting to mean tweets. They were responding to a president who is actively undermining the constitutional system by threatening lawmakers with death for performing oversight. That crosses every red line that exists in American democracy. But let me tell you what those death threats actually mean for the people receiving them. Because constitutional crisis isn't just an abstract concept when you're the lawmaker whose children are asking why strangers want to kill their parent for doing their job. Let me tell you about Representative Jamie Raskin, constitutional lawyer, former impeachment manager, father of 3. Within 2 hours of the president's seditious behavior post, Raskin's office received 47 phone calls. 32 of them contained explicit death threats. His staff had to change their daily routines. His family had to alter their movements around Maryland. His district office implemented security protocols that make it harder for constituents to access their representative. Raskin told reporters, "My staff shouldn't have to fear for their lives because I'm asking questions about presidential fitness." That is not the America we're supposed to be. Let that sink in. A sitting congressman is having to comfort his staff about death threats because he's doing constitutional oversight. And Representative Raskin is not alone. Senator Chuck Schumer's New York office documented 63 threatening calls in one day. The threats were specific. They mentioned his home address. They referenced his family members by name. Schumer's security detail was immediately expanded. His public events were restricted. His ability to engage with New York constituents was fundamentally altered because the president suggested he deserved death. Think about what that means for democracy. When lawmakers can't safely perform oversight because the president incites violence against them, the constitutional system breaks down. Not in theory, in practice. Congressional staff member Maria Santos, who works for Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, told her family she was considering leaving her job. Not because of policy disagreements, not because of political pressure, because strangers were calling her workplace, saying she should be executed alongside her boss for seditious behavior. Santos said, "I believed in public service. I didn't sign up to fear for my life because my boss asks tough questions about presidential conduct." Let that sink in. Talented people are leaving public service because presidential rhetoric creates genuine danger for anyone involved in congressional oversight. But here's the human cost that doesn't make headlines. The families. Representative Adam Schiff's daughter asked him why the president wants him dead. How do you explain to a child that the President of the United States suggested their parent deserves execution for doing their constitutional job? Schiff told reporters, no parent should have to have that conversation. No child should have to fear that their mum or dad might not come home because they work in Congress. Think about that for a moment. Children of lawmakers are now afraid their parents might be killed for doing oversight. That is what presidential death threats create in real families. District offices across America had to implement new security measures: bulletproof glass, metal detectors, restricted access. The very offices designed to connect representatives with constituents became fortified bunkers because the president normalized threatening lawmakers with death. Translation: presidential rhetoric is directly destroying the accessibility of democratic representation. When constituents can't safely visit their representative's office because of security concerns triggered by presidential threats, democracy stops functioning at the most basic level. And here's the mathematics of fear. 22 officials received death threats, but each of those officials has staff, each has family members, each has district operations affecting hundreds of employees. One presidential post threatening death created a ripple effect of fear and security disruption, affecting thousands of people whose only crime was working in democratic institutions. This isn't about hurt feelings or political theatre. This is about the president's words creating genuine terror among the people responsible for checking presidential power. When oversight becomes dangerous because the president incites violence, the constitutional system collapses. Not gradually, immediately. But when senators call for the 25th Amendment, what exactly are they asking for? And why are constitutional scholars saying we're witnessing an unprecedented stress test of American democratic institutions? Let me walk you through the constitutional mathematics of what happens when a president becomes unfit for office. Section 4 of the 25th Amendment has never been used in American history. Not during Nixon's final days, not during Reagan's Alzheimer's concerns. Never, because the constitutional requirements are so demanding that removal is nearly impossible unless there's overwhelming bipartisan agreement that a president cannot function. Here's how it works. Vice President J.D. Vance would need to agree that Trump is incapacitated. Then a majority of Trump's cabinet would need to sign a written declaration that the president cannot discharge his duties. Both Vance and the cabinet majority would submit this declaration to Congress. Power would immediately transfer to Vance as acting president. But here's where the mathematics become almost impossible. Trump could contest the declaration. If he does, Congress has 21 days to decide, and they need a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate to permanently remove him. That means 67 senators and 290 House members would need to agree that Trump is unfit. Think about those numbers. In our current political environment, finding 67 senators to agree on anything is nearly impossible. Finding that many to remove a president of their own party. Constitutional scholars say it's functionally impossible unless the incapacity is so obvious that even partisan loyalty cannot overcome it. So when Senator Ed Markey calls for invoking the 25th Amendment, he's not calling for something that will actually happen. He's making a statement that the situation has become so alarming that even impossible constitutional remedies need to be discussed. But international allies are watching these discussions with genuine concern. Danish Parliament deputy Lars Christian Brask didn't just suggest Congress take control. He used the word mad to describe presidential behaviour. In diplomatic language, that's extraordinary. Allies don't publicly question the mental stability of American presidents unless they're genuinely worried about the implications for global stability. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau privately expressed concerns to European Union leaders about American reliability under current leadership. President Emmanuel Macron told advisers that France is planning contingencies for reduced American predictability in NATO operations. Translation: our closest allies are quietly preparing for the possibility that America cannot be relied upon for consistent foreign policy decisions. Dr. Jonathan Reiner's call for a bipartisan fitness probe isn't just medical concern. It's recognition that the normal political processes aren't adequate when you're dealing with potential incapacity at the presidential level. Reiner has experience with high-level officials. When he says Congress needs to investigate fitness, he's saying the evidence has reached a threshold where medical evaluation becomes a national security imperative. Constitutional scholar Lawrence Tribe analysed the current situation and concluded that we're witnessing the stress testing of democratic institutions that were never designed to handle a president who actively threatens lawmakers for performing oversight. The founders assumed that someone reaching the presidency would respect basic democratic norms. They didn't design systems to handle a president who suggests Congress members deserve death. And here's the systematic breakdown we're witnessing. First, presidential fitness concerns create erratic behaviour. Second, erratic behaviour manifests as threats against the legislative branch. Third, legislative threats disrupt congressional oversight capacity. Fourth, disrupted oversight means no constitutional check on presidential power. Fifth, unchecked presidential power with questionable fitness creates existential risk to democratic institutions. The White House claims this is a political witch hunt. Translation: they're hoping you won't notice that fitness concerns, threatening behaviour, and constitutional crisis are connected in a way that transcends normal political opposition. But here's what constitutional experts are saying privately that they won't say publicly. The American system depends on the assumption that presidents will respect democratic norms even when they have the power to violate them. When that assumption breaks down, the constitutional framework itself becomes inadequate. We're not just dealing with a difficult president, we're dealing with the discovery that our democratic institutions may not be robust enough to handle someone who actively rejects democratic constraints while wielding presidential power. That is why 3 senators felt compelled to mention the nuclear option, because the normal political processes are proving insufficient for the constitutional crisis we're actually facing. So where does this leave us? Because what happened in one day isn't just a political crisis that will blow over. It's a warning about what happens when presidential fitness concerns collide with threats against the legislative branch. And the implications stretch far beyond Washington. Here's what we're looking at if this becomes normalized. If threatening lawmakers with death becomes acceptable presidential behavior, oversight dies. If oversight dies, the constitutional system of checks and balances collapses. If checks and balances collapse, you don't have a democracy anymore. You have something else entirely. The 2026 midterm elections are already being affected. Democratic candidates are receiving enhanced security briefings because of credible threats tied to presidential rhetoric. Some potential candidates are reconsidering running for Congress because they've watched what happens to lawmakers who perform oversight. Translation: presidential death threats are already reducing the pool of people willing to serve in democratic institutions. State and local governments are watching this constitutional crisis and making their own calculations. If federal oversight can be intimidated into silence, what happens to federal coordination on everything from disaster response to public health emergencies? When the president suggests lawmakers deserve death, it creates uncertainty about whether any government institution can function normally. Our international allies are privately discussing contingency plans for reduced American leadership reliability. NATO operations are being quietly restructured to account for potential American unpredictability. Trade agreements are including new clauses addressing partner nation instability. The global community is preparing for the possibility that America cannot be counted on for consistent policy decisions. Think about what that means for American influence. For 75 years, American leadership has depended on other nations trusting our institutional stability. When allies start planning around American unpredictability, our global position fundamentally changes. Not because of policy disagreements, but because of concerns about whether our democratic institutions can constrain presidential behaviour. And here's the historical parallel that should alarm everyone. Every democracy that collapsed in the 20th century followed a similar pattern. First, fitness concerns about leadership were dismissed as political attacks. Second, threats against oversight institutions became normalised.